I'm probably asking for trouble with this one, but okay, here goes. So the phrase skill issue gets thrown around a lot, often to discredit someone who dislikes a game, whether their gripe is reasonable or not. And this bugs me for a multitude of reasons. While I could just throw out my own retorts to the phrase and make this a short instead, since one of my biggest issues is the utter unwillingness to engage that skill issue often showcases, I think I'll yammer on for a bit instead and try to have an actual discussion. Though, if you're good, maybe I'll throw in a few barbs at the end. So I'm Wes, the Explosion, let's get started. Maybe one of the weaker points, but it still might be likely to appeal to the sort of person to use the phrase, is that it diminishes their own skill. I can't solve a Rubik's Cube or juggle 5 chainsaws, I just don't have the spatial awareness or dexterity. Yet despite this being due to my lack of ability, it's unlikely that someone would accuse me of having a skill issue, but instead would credit someone who could as being impressive. And let's be real, a lot of the games being brought up in this context are pretty dang hard. I know a lot of times skill issue is kinda thrown in someone's face to imply that they're beneath the speaker and not worth listening to, but if being on your level is considered basic and required to be taken seriously, well then being able to clear the sacred program isn't really all that impressive, is it? To put it another way, I was recently told about some CEO who values intelligence, to the point where if you aren't as smart as he is, he doesn't want to hear what you have to say and will kick you out of the room. But by that logic, doesn't that mean that he's always the dumbest person there? Likewise, if you only talk to people at your skill level, well, then that means that you're always the weakest. Rather than take this attitude, why not give yourself some credit and admit that maybe you can do something that not everyone can? Just try not to overdo it, since getting hyperbolic can get you labeled as a liar. I swear, whenever I see someone claim that they could beat an infamous section in an NES game back when they were a toddler and probably barely had the motor functions to put the cartridge in the console, I find myself doubting whether they ever beat the game at all. So hey, have some confidence, just not too much confidence. But let's say that you are so good at Cuphead that you beat it in under an hour with a broken wrist before you even really got the controls down completely. Chances are your opinion on the difficulty really isn't going to be worth much. When you get good at something, maybe even specializing in it, the one area that you can still struggle with is pinning down just how hard what you do actually is. My brother is insanely good at Fire Emblem. He's constantly replaying the games, and I think he's completed Lunatic or Maddening or whatever the highest setting is in each. And he managed to get pretty high in the rankings in the Fire Emblem Heroes mobile game without needing to spend a dime. Until they completely wrecked the unit balance, and he dropped it. I think calling him an expert wouldn't be too much of a stretch, but the one aspect I absolutely do not trust him on is judging how hard each game is. I mean, I do when it comes to comparisons. He's never told me anything crazy like Conquest is actually the easiest of the Fate routes, but he has described some hard modes as undemanding, in a series known for being so punishing that they had to introduce things like casual mode and rewinds so that just the standard difficulty would be palatable to general audiences. I'd consider myself pretty good at the series, nowhere near his level, but still. I've been playing since they first started localizing it and still have permadeath turned on. While I did beat Engage, the latest game on hard, I struggled a fair bit, so when my brother called it pretty easy, I chalked it up to me just not min-maxing my weapons and EXP gains enough. When I talked to him about possibly streaming the game together, with him as a coach to maybe help me with the aspects that were giving me trouble, at first he said he probably wouldn't have time. Then he came back to suggest that we do a challenge run. What part of, I had trouble with this and one help so that maybe I can have a smoother time, do you not understand? I also started replaying Awakening, another one that he seemed to think wasn't too hard, and while I am pushing through it, I did need to reset a bunch in the beginning, before I got settled into a groove. And hey, I'm not gonna act innocent in all this either. I have plenty of trouble gauging just how difficult a platformer can be for the average player. When I first played Cuphead, I got the same hard but fair impression that everyone else did, though I had a lot more faith in people. I managed to get through it despite making some questionable decisions, and while I will in no way say it was easy, I did think that as long as someone stuck with it, they could clear it. Then I heard someone talk about dropping it when they got to Beppy. Then I heard a group I listened to talk about how someone they knew beat the game and how impressive they thought it was. Then I watched several people start the game, progress through it pretty well, at least I thought, and then hit a brick wall. My own siblings, who I consider pretty good at games in general, ended up returning the copy I lent them after getting to Matchstick, and I had to admit, maybe I was underselling the difficulty a bit. I struggle with this constantly when I do reviews, since I do think that giving people an idea on how much resistance they can expect is an important aspect of a game. But I play so many platformers myself that a lot of things come naturally and can, once again, end up really underestimating how hard something is. For the longest time, I didn't like Kirby's Return to Dreamland because the people I played co-op with were so horrible at it that they just kept getting in the way and eating up our lives. And if I can't even safely call Kirby easy, well, then what can I? What I typically try to do is remember how hard a game was when I first played it, and if it isn't a retro game that I can look back at, I'll try to find one that's comparable that I can use as a base. In the beginning, I did get a few comments saying that any Mega Man fan wouldn't find a particular classic or X game hard at all, and I had to explain, respectfully, that I was doing it more for a new player. Maybe that's dumb, after all, who else is going to be looking up Mega Man reviews in the 2020s, but at the same time, my biggest concern is for new players, since they're important for growing the fan base, and giving them an idea on what to expect can help ease them into things. I also wouldn't want to invalidate their experience by calling a game easy, especially if I remember having trouble with it myself 20 years ago. Sometimes I still miss the mark on this though. And for any veteran players feeling like I'm ignoring them here, I do oftentimes try to include a note about the challenge different experience levels can expect, but at the same time, if you've played through Mega Man 2 dozens of times, you don't need me to tell you to watch out for the Boo Beam Trap or the stingy or Wily Fortress checkpoints. You're far beyond that. Though, watch the review anyway. I probably have something clever to say about the Metal Blade or whatever. But my big thing is, of course, that skill issue is often used to dismiss anything negative someone might have to say about a game, whether or not the complaint has any merit, or to even acknowledge that others might have different preferences. I sometimes catch flack for my burning hatred of Mega Man X6, and skill issue is definitely something I've heard. The thing is though, those two words do nothing to refute my points that the game lies to you, has inconsistent rules, the stages seem designed to actively waste your time, you take a lot less damage than in previous games to counteract just how much crap they throw on screen at once, the gate stage bosses are maybe the worst in the franchise, the nightmare effects are annoying, and the game is, just in general, not fun to play. And if you want to argue with me on any of these things, frickin' good! If you can teach me tricks, something I didn't know, or just a new perspective that could possibly make the game more tolerable, that'd be amazing! And even if you can't convince me, an Ace Attorney style debate on the subject sounds really fun besides. But skill issue? The only one I can see is your inability to argue a frickin' point. No wait, I said I'd save my sass for the end. As for myself, well, it might not be the speed run, but last X6 playthrough, it took me about 2 hours, which I think is pretty good, and this was the final boss. Yeah, wow, really need a lot of skill to finish that. Another game that I have an issue with is the Wonderful 101. That might cause some knee-jerk reactions, and I'll admit, Platinum games don't always exactly click with me. But my problem isn't so much with the game or gameplay itself so much as its communication skills. You see, after the first level, the game encourages you to spend your funny money on upgrades, which, nothing crazy there. There's also a few that it specifically recommends, which again is pretty standard. Of course, you don't have enough to buy them all, so you need to make a choice. The thing is, one of them is practically essential for playing the game, a transformation that turns you into a sci-fi friendship-powered pudding which reflects some enemy attacks while making short work of them. If you don't have it, well, I don't think the next stage is impossible, but it kinda feels like coming at wood carving with a dull butter knife. Things take so much longer and you're likely to break before you finish. So if you were to say, buy the wrong abilities or just do what I typically do, hold off on purchasing anything until you have a better idea of how the game works and what would serve you best, I believe it would be reasonable to think that the game sucks. It doesn't help that the levels, at least the few that I saw, are really long. So it's not really a matter of struggling through a few minutes of gameplay or quickly failing and then reevaluating either. Since the complaint would likely be that the Wonderful 101 is a horrible game because it's just unreasonably hard, it would be easy to chalk it up to a skill issue, but just a bit of digging might be able to help you come up with the right advice and turn it into a top-tier game for someone. Regardless of whether it's due to actual issues or just a dumb mistake, my point is, just calling it a skill issue is kind of the easy way out. But it'd be disingenuous of me to pretend that sometimes it isn't just the skill issue. The other week, I was at a family gathering and a relative talked smack on Mega Man because he wasn't any good at it. And he said he didn't like Sonic's games just because he couldn't keep up with them. You think you get a pass just because you're 8? No! On a more serious note, I saw someone complain about 20XX, a Mega Man X-style roguelite, saying about how the game didn't drop enough currency to permanently upgrade yourself in between runs, and I thought it was pretty reasonable. I was able to gradually get further and further in each attempt, and cleared the game in roughly the time listed on how long to beat. When I told my friend who got even more into the game than me, he agreed that the guy probably just kinda sucked. That does beg the question though, how skilled at a game should someone be before you just write off their complaints as not being very good at it? If you're having trouble with the title, it's likely due to either it just not working, you not being smart enough to figure out a puzzle, or, most commonly, and what we're talking about here, you lacking the skill to clear it. Different games have different thresholds. There are those aimed at casual players, those at the more average, and even some where the point seems to be beating you into a pulp until pulling off some crazy nonsensical maneuver becomes second nature. And people's individual abilities can be all over the place. So where should the expectation be? Being able to clear the game in a reasonable time frame without assistance? Able to complete the tutorial and maybe a few levels? Memorizing multiple 20-button combos? Not succumbing to carpal tunnel trying to play a shooter on a system that it wasn't designed for? Being able to dodge around and counter a boss for 5 minutes when they can kill you in just a few seconds. Being able to beat a game on the Virtual Boy before you get a massive migraine, throw up, and stay bedridden for a full week? The answer is something I don't have, because it can vary a lot between not just games, but individual players. Though I still think that in most cases, it's worth hearing the other person out. You could wind up learning something about what other people have trouble or take issue with, as well as about yourself, about your preferences, and maybe what you're willing to tolerate that others aren't. You might also be able to help a newer player out and create a new fan for your franchise, or at least point them towards another that might be more their speed. I know there's definitely been times when I didn't like a game just because I wasn't good at it, but it can be really hard to tell in the moment whether your anger is due to legitimate gripes, you just missing something, or simply a lack of ability, which is why actual conversation can be so valuable. Granted, with all this, I might be assuming too much about how willing you are to engage on a topic, but I'm also kind of figuring that if you care enough about a game to search out discourse on it, you probably also care enough to talk about it. But there are also those who love an echo chamber. And another addendum, or maybe allowance, I should make is that some conversations just aren't worth having. If the discussion is done in bad faith, either them refusing to bend on a subject despite having no counterpoints of their own, or just obviously having it out for whatever they're talking about, yeah, maybe they aren't worth listening to. I still remember a Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity review where within the first line, they more or less said that they hate all Musou games, and I had to wonder why they were even talking about it. Imagine if I did a Halo review where I called it one of the worst games of all time, where my entire thesis was just that I didn't like FPSs. Even in those cases though, I think you can tell pretty quick when the other person is not willing to have a conversation and just trying to stir the pot. In which case, yeah, you can leave early. At least you can leave the conversation knowing that you weren't the asshole, which I think is a worthy goal. And even if the other person takes it as an admission of defeat, well, I'd say being able to hold yourself in esteem is more important than them doing so. For the most part though, rather than just write someone off, I think it's more worthwhile to discuss your differing opinions. I might also be ignoring the biggest reason behind the skill issue comment, and that's just to be mean. I'll admit, it used to bother me. A random fleeting insult can feel a bit similar to someone swooping in, throwing a punch, and then running away before you have the chance to fight back. And though maybe you can reply back to the comment that uses it, I think we can all imagine how that would go. About as productive as arguing with a toddler. That's why these days, when those two words pop up, I'm mostly just exasperated. Because it's just so damn boring. Actual conversation? That's something I can think about and interact with, but skill issue or even get good? All you're doing is parroting somebody else's slightly more clever way of saying, you suck, which wasn't all that clever the first time it was uttered, and certainly isn't the sickest burn you can come up with, or at least I hope it isn't. So if we do want to get into my method of countering skill issue, I think it would be to simply say to anyone using it, you bore me. I can't even call it a nice try since it's just regurgitating an overused quote, and if you were to hit me with actual vomit, that'd at least get more of a reaction from me. If you're gonna insult me, at least make it interesting. Or, to reuse what I said earlier, the only skill issue here is your inability to demonstrate wit and form an actual argument. I apologize to any actual children I'm calling out with this. How's that for a spicy rebuttal? Maybe this entire video was pointless, since I probably could have summed the subject up as, people be buttholes. But I hope that at least someone manages to get something out of this, so I guess I should ask. Do you ever use the phrase? Have you had it used on you? Does it bug you? And do you have any witty retorts of your own for it? Think that'll do it. So thanks as always for watching, and maybe consider subscribing if you too are a hardcore gamer TM. I'm the coolest.